Okay, our next lesson is called Life of a Slave. So far we've talked about many differences between the North and the South. Make sure you review those. Our objectives for our lesson today is to understand the lifestyle and problems of being a slave in 19th century America. Look at your vocabulary words. A lack of respect or reverence for a person or thing is disrespect. A loosely woven fabric made from yarn used by slaves was called homespun. Okay, I want you to get your notes out. Do not go to a new page. Do not rip pages out of your notebook. I just want you to just go to the next line wherever you were in your notes. I want you to write the date and just start right there. Life of a slave. My nest is bigger, but you don't pay your finches. I do. Mine work without pay, but you never let them go home at the end of the day. My nest is their home. Mine are free to go to their own homes. Imagine the following, okay? You wake up one morning expecting to get ready for school as usual. Instead, you find your wrists and ankles in chains. Some guy looks down at you, smiles, and then yanks the chain, forcing you to go with him. You cry out to your folks for help. Then you notice that other people who are holding them back. Next thing you know, you're thrown into the back of a van and driven away. When you're finally let go, it is in a place where you have never been. The men pull out whips and begin striking you as they yell, "Get to work!" You see many other people working in fields, and they all look so tired and hungry. You are now a slave, and there is nothing you can do about it. The average American today would have a difficult time understanding what it was like being a slave. Slavery as an institution had been outlawed in most civilized nations by the 19th century, but in the United States it continued to exist. Those who supported this institution did so for various reasons. Ultimately, though, slavery was to become the focal point as the struggle between the North and the South continued. Background of slavery in America. Okay, I'm going to make a web today. Slavery. The issue of slavery became part of the American culture early in the country's history. In 1619, a Dutch ship traded slaves to the Jamestown colony in Virginia in return for supplies. These people became indentured servants, meaning they had the opportunity to work for their freedom. Over the course of time, however, slavery took on a whole new meaning. So the first recorded incident of slavery in the United States was in 1619. A Dutch ship traded slaves. A Dutch ship traded slaves for supplies in Jamestown. Okay, and these were indentured servants. So in the beginning, they were considered indentured servants. Indentured servants. That means they can work for their freedom. Okay. And I did spell that wrong. That's an A. The invention of the cotton gin by Eli Whitney in 1793 unintentionally set into motion the practice of chattel slavery. Okay. When Eli Whitney invented the cotton gin, he did not invent it to support slaves. That's just the effect that it had. Okay. And so they went from being indentured slaves to chattel. T-T-E-L. Is that right? Yeah. Chattel slavery. The cotton gin suddenly made the crop very profitable to grow. Huge cotton plantations were formed, growing thousands of acres of cotton. Such large plantations needed workers. In order to maintain this thriving business, plantation owners resorted to buying slaves. And because it was necessary to keep the workers needed to carry on the business, the status of the slaves changed. Chattel slavery developed from this need. In essence, chattel slavery meant that a slave was a slave for life. Unlike indentured servants, chattel slaves were not allowed to work for their freedom. They were denied any rights and were treated as property. So the invention of the cotton gin changed the position of slavery. With chattel slavery, now they're not even considered as people anymore. They're treated like property. They have no rights. Okay, chattel slavery means they're treated like property, no rights. Being an indentured servant was bad enough, but now they're considered chattel slaves. Characteristics of the slave life. It's difficult for people living in the 21st century to understand the life of a 19th century slave. The gradual shift from indentured servant to chattel slave also marked a change in the way African people were viewed by plantation owners. In most cases, the slave was looked upon principally as a way to make money. Because they are now considered property, it was not uncommon for slaves to be treated poorly. This was not always the case. Some plantation owners treated the slaves fairly well, but since slaves could be purchased cheaply, it was not necessary to spend a lot of money making sure they were well cared for. Typically, slaves would begin to work in fields at the age of 12. Okay, so at 12 years old, they work in the fields. They were expected to work from sunup to sundown. Sunup to sundown. Breaks were few, if any. Meals consisted of the very basics, such as hominy corn and salt pork. So meals were hominy, corn, and salt pork. The living conditions were no better. Often slaves lived in dirt-floored one-room shacks. Okay, so they lived in shacks with dirt floors, okay, there's one room. 6 to 12 slaves would be housed together. So there's 6. Okay. So they lived in shacks with dirt floors. 6 to 12 slaves lived together. Additionally, long work hours, poor nourishment, and dirty living conditions led to many medical problems. Okay, so there were many medical problems. They didn't want to spend their money on slaves. Malaria, yellow fever, cholera, tuberculosis, typhoid, typhus, tetanus, and pneumonia took terrible tolls. Many slaves were infected with worms, dysentery, and severe dental problems. Little money was spent on their health issues. It was cheaper for the owner to just allow a sick slave to die and purchase another one than it was to take care of his or her physical needs. The life expectancy of a slave was very short due to these adverse conditions. So slaves have had a short lifespan. Short lifespan. Okay. Most clothing worn by slaves was homespun, a made of material purchased from factories in the north or from England. This kind of cloth was very cheap. The clothes did not fit very well, and it was not uncommon for most children to wear only shirts. Few slaves could afford shoes, so most went barefoot, even in the winter. Okay. So clothes. Let's see, where can I put this? I'll put this down here. Clothes. They wore homespun, which they said is a very cheap material. And they said that they couldn't afford shoes, so a lot of them just didn't wear shoes. Some of the kids only wore shirts. And that's, again, is another thing that's causing them to become very sick. Let's talk about their family life. Well, before we do that, let's look at the purple box for more information. Harriet Beecher Stowe published Uncle Tom's Cabin in 1852. This school teacher from Connecticut grew up in an abolitionist home while living in Ohio. She became very upset about slavery, that she decided to write about it. For more than 2 years, she interviewed former slaves and slaveholders and read a number of books. Much of her inspiration came from Josiah Henson, a fugitive slave who had escaped to Canada. She relied on his memoirs to gather information about slavery. Uncle Tom's Cabin became an instant success. Northerners became angrier about slavery, and Southerners condemned the book as untrue. Her novel was so influential in the war to come that Abraham Lincoln told her when they first met, "So you're the little woman who wrote the book that started this great war." This true story of a great American illustrates the truth that anyone can change the world. Okay, let's talk about the family life as a slave. What do you think their family life's like? Owners understood the strength of family ties, so it was common practice for slaves to be torn apart from loved ones in order to make it easier to control them. Therefore, it was not unusual for a slave to be sold more than once in his lifetime. Children were especially vulnerable to being taken away from parents when they reached the age at which they could be put to work. Okay, so they separated families so they could control them easier. Separated from family. Further, slaves had to have the owner's consent to be married. Once married, the couple knew that at some point their children were likely to be sold to another owner and never heard from again. This only added to the difficult circumstances they had to endure. Slaves were not always made to work every day. Generally, they were given Sundays off as a day of rest and worship. Many slaves gathered strength from their belief in God. In addition to worship, slaves used Sundays as an opportunity to rest and relax or for tending to small gardens. These helped to supplement their poor diets. The day off also used for recreation in the form of singing and dancing. This time off depended on the owner. When a family member passed away, the slaves were allowed to have a funeral. However, funerals were only allowed at night, so they would not interfere with the daily work schedule. Again, this only illustrates the point that slaves were considered as property and not as human beings. Okay. Let's see, where can I put it on my chart? Usually they were given Sundays off. Sundays off. Okay, usually they were given Sundays off. Funerals were only allowed at night, so they were allowed to have funerals as long as it didn't interfere with their work. Funerals at night. Let's talk about punishments. One of the most horrible aspects of slavery that many people are unaware of is the punishment dealt out-of-control slaves who were unruly or did not act in the way the owners wanted them to. No sign of disrespect was ever allowed by slaves towards whites. Slaves were expected to bow each time they encountered a white person. Wow. Okay. They were not allowed to show any form of disrespect.